So, to test for your stripe black belt, you are required to write 5 sentences about the importance of compassion. So, I decided to write 5 paragraphs. And this is going into why do you cultivate compassion, what is compassion, and the importance of compassion, along with a bonus tip. So let's jump right into it. So a lot of people talk about how compassion is so important and how you need to be like kind and sympathetic and like put yourself in other people's shoes and feel bad for them, right? But I have an understanding of compassion that I think is different from the usual norm that I believe fully grasps the power that it has. So let's first talk about why cultivate compassion. So, when it comes down to it, there's no real logical reason to get angry in the developed world. By the developed world, I mean where your life isn't threatened every other day by either a tiger or when you come across another person and it triggers your fight or flight response. We evolved to have anger as a territorial cognitive function. When our ancestors became threatened, the anger would trigger them to attack the threat and to defend themselves. But these days in the modern world, where you are not threatened, where your life is not threatened, the way you succeed is not by letting your emotions take over and cloud your mind, but to listen and think things through logically. Anger is no longer a useful emotion in the developed world. In fact, it is often highly destructive. So, how do we fight it? With compassion. First, I'm going to define compassion. My definition of compassion is seeing that, well, I guess I should say our definition of compassion because Sue might help me out with this, is seeing that others have different paradigms and perceptions of the world and attempting to understand them. These days, anger is often triggered by disagreements or miscommunication that comes from people seeing the world in a different way than others. It seems pretty illogical to get angry at someone when it is because they have a different view, they see reality differently. This is where you cultivate compassion. In my definition, trying to understand and see things from their perspective. Now, it's not that easy. It takes a lot of confidence and control of emotions to first not emotionally respond with anger, and second, to have curiosity to genuinely try to understand someone's perspective on things. But even though it's hard to do, it comes up so often. I So, one example is that when I was reading this article to Chloe, we had a disagreement, or I should say, a misunderstanding about something in the article about whether anger is a useful emotion. And okay, and so we spent a few minutes arguing that eventually turned into an argument about who interrupts the other person more. And so I was like, okay, let's clear up because we can actually use this article to help us with our disagreement. And so we'll get to that later, but using compassion comes up all the time, and we were able to sort things out and eventually realize that we actually completely agreed with each other and just had different ways of saying it. Okay. So that's a big example of the importance of compassion because everyone always will have disagreements and misunderstandings in their life, just just either little things or big things that can cause a few minutes of anger or an entire war in history. And so attempting to see someone's perspective of life, their own lens through which they see reality, and attempting to understand it can build better relationships, have more effective communication, decrease frustration and conflict with others, increase our persuadability because we are able to speak to others' view of reality and how it differs, and have better leadership skills for the same reason. Compassion is key in today's world where anger serves no useful purpose. It is about understanding and respecting the diverse perspectives and realities of those around us, rather than letting differences fuel frustration and conflict. So, if you want to have better relationships, communication, and leadership, try to exercise some compassion, and remember that we all need to learn from others to find truth. Okay, so now the moment you've all been waiting for, or maybe not, the rainbow bonus tip. Okay, so this is what me and Chloe used on this very same Zoom call, or maybe not, when we had our disagreement about this article, or I should say misunderstanding. So the way we sorted out is, first I was like, okay, let's use this. What is it that you think, or what is your point of view? And then once she finished, I tried to explain it back to her. And by this time, all of the frustration and tension had pretty much dissolved, because I was asking her a question about what she thought rather than defending what I thought, which turned out to be the same thing, actually. Um, and I was also nodding and saying, yeah, because I saw it as the same thing. And then I explained it back to her, and she said, yes, that's right. And then I explained what I thought. I said, this is specifically what this is clearly what's my opinion. And then if there's still a disagreement, now you see exactly why you disagree with what you disagree, and then you can ask, what specifically do you disagree with and why? And I can't tell you how clear and helpful this structure has been in both debates and misunderstandings. And if you follow this, and if you try to exercise compassion, which, like I said, is not the easiest thing, but if you try to exercise compassion, you will build that skill. And I'm telling you, it's going to improve your life so much more. Thank you for listening to my presentation.
Fantastic. You know who else has a bonus tip is Chloe's mom. She was explaining this yesterday. The way of handling some kind of powerful emotion. What do you do?
Yeah, I sent made a video on it, which I'm supposed to publish on YouTube today.
Just take a break, sleep on it. You know that you've heard the phrase "sleep on it," right? Sleep on it. You know, so simple. It's like,
Yeah, I I actually find my anger exceedingly useful. Very useful. Not, I mean, not just for the individual, for me, because when I feel the anger, uh, it's a trigger, right? That some sort of uh, somebody or a situation or whatever is pushing up against a boundary, right? And so it is an opportunity to explore. And I also think it might be useful in self-determination, right? And especially as you're exploring self-determination and what are the parameters for you as an individual. So But I agree that how you decide to respond to is totally different thing, right?
Right. That's exactly what me and Chloe were arguing about. That we actually realized we believe the same thing. Because she was saying, wait, no?
Aila, I've got a question for you. What makes you angry?
Uh,
All the things.
what? No! Okay, so what Chloe was explaining to me when we were following this structure.
Not about Chloe. What makes you angry? Completely outside of the context of this conversation. Give me one example of something that makes you angry.
What makes Dad angry is when
Someone talks down to you, Aila.
Well, that depends on who it is.
Okay.
Oh, so little girls actually aren't very smart, so they should just not open their mouths. Okay, so what was the feeling you had inside you that caused the anger? What was the anger a representative of, a trigger of?
Well, I think it's just that my whole life I've been treated like an adult with the consequences and responsibilities of an adult, except when I was like to like one to five, that was when the discipline was. But apart from there, that I was like treated like an adult. Um so I guess it just doesn't align. But what I'm saying is that there's a complete difference from the emotion anger. All emotions are just there. Like we evolved to have them, and we can't really live without the emotion anger, because like you said, it shows our um like it shows, well, it's emotions drive motion. We need emotions.
The boundaries,
Different.
right? Like what
Yeah.
Nicholas said.
The difference is when it triggers you to react. You kind of need to, like, the anger goes off, right? A little ding. Something happened that I didn't like. And sometimes but you can't react with that, and you can't have it absorb you if because me and Chloe, we didn't get anywhere with with that argument we were having before we used that structure, because
well, we understood the point of being compassionate to each other.
well, yeah, I mean, before we started using that structure, we weren't getting anywhere because we were more driven by the negative emotions. Would you agree, Chloe?
Yes.
Yeah. I'm not saying only you were. I'm just saying we were both. And then, but yeah.
And try to answer that question. What makes you angry? You're talking about not being treated like a child since you were 5. So what makes you angry consistently?
Well, that's one thing that can make me angry, is being talked down to, especially by people that don't know who I am,
Why does that bother you?
because I think it's unjust.
Bingo.
Well,
Very good self-diagnostic. One of the most common reasons people get angry, including what your mom mentioned about boundaries, is injustice. And so when you get angry, there's a very high likelihood, anybody, that what they're perceiving at its core is a sense of injustice. I'm being accused of something that's not correct. Something is being done to me that is unjust. And so when people get older, they start developing more and more patterns that can become more and more dysfunctional if they don't address those things. So by starting really early, knowing that when I get angry, it's probably that I'm feeling injustice, then asking questions to find out, okay, what is the injustice here? before somebody fires back in the conversation, before you squirt that toothpaste out of the toothpaste tube that you can never put back in. That's what your words always are in a conversation.
Okay.
Yeah.
Toothpaste.
Well, what I'm saying is that the anger can go off, but a lot of the time it is not useful because it was a misunderstanding and because what are you going to do about that? So sometimes, well, that depends on the situation. Like if some two people have a disagreement, then if you know what happened, or at least it was pretty clear, and it's not like one person has their idea and the other person has their idea. It's that there's someone who is talking down to you in an objective way, and then that anger can go off and that lets you know, right? So, I
Why
mean,
did
I
you
mean,
interrupt this? Make you angry.
there are people in the world who think like, little girls shouldn't, open their mouth and they aren't very
be
smart. And
seen, not
a
heard.
lot of the
Yeah, he's right here.
I
But oftentimes that just comes from the way that they were raised, and because they're, it's not necessarily completely their fault. And
Yeah.
the best thing to do isn't to, get angry at them, but to,
Yeah, it's not.
well, this person probably wasn't very, educated. They didn't have the privilege of, the knowledge that we have now. And then you see a lot of people getting angry at, dead people in history for, having slaves or, being racist and sexist and these things. And it's like, well, this is not something that is helpful because one, those people are dead. We can't do anything about it. But then also, because you have to think about people in the context of their environment and who and how they grew up and all of these factors.
Yeah.
yeah, those people
I mean,
weren't
even there, I mean,
those
even there, oh,
you
I mean, even there, anger is not useful because you can know logically, you can know in your head that something isn't just. Like, I have the emotion, right? But I can explain to you why I think it's unjust. And you can know that logically, and that's going to be a lot more useful than anger going off because then it's not helpful. Because it's better to think, okay, this is their perspective. I don't need to get angry at them. That's what I'm saying. There's no real need to get angry at them.
Well,
If
So,
you
Ayla, I
want
think
to,
you are saying, oh, you are not actually, you are not saying that people shouldn't feel angry. What you are really saying is that your response after you feel angry should not be like shooting the toothpaste out of the tube, like that.
well, I
You
mean,
that was the analogy, right? So we still feel angry, but just your actions, that's the emotion, and the emotion shouldn't be, shooting the toothpaste out of the tube that you can't put back in, right?
Although
well,
So
I mean,
I think
okay,
you can
so I
reframe
also
your
think,
emotional response.
yeah,
If you're actively and intentionally practicing compassion when you're angry, I think you can retrain your initial response for certain actions. Like, I'll tell you what I felt when you said your comment earlier, obviously jokingly, was a bit of surprise, and then just kind of like what just happened there. It wasn't just like an immediate anger response, because I think that one thing that we've been trying to do and practice as a family is, if somebody does something that would trigger anger, we would think about, well, what is it like from their perspective? How can we actually help them? Given that, just telling them like, you did this wrong because is usually not going to help. And given their, core values and beliefs, how can we help them become open-minded to new perspectives, without triggering a defensive mechanism that kind of just closes their mind. So
that's an excellent point. And it's related to something that anger causes in other people, which is anger. Right? When you express anger, not feel, but express anger, another person sees that, they know they haven't done anything wrong, not to get that kind of a reaction. And so they get angry back because they're not going to accept that injustice. Right?
Yep, it's a vicious cycle.
It's like I was just gonna say somebody wrote a project about that.
Okay, yeah, so I still, um, in this developed world, I still don't think that anger is a particularly useful emotion. I don't like see like you can also retrain your emotional response. I'm not saying that anger is bad. I'm saying it's not useful. And
It's
in
useful in a few niche circumstances, but
in a
why
few
is it
niche
useful?
circumstances, not in the developed world.
Not in the everyday common world.
That's what I mean by developed world where your life isn't being threatened.
Walk in the wrong neighborhood.
Okay,
You would say that the US is a developed country, yeah?
Someone got assaulted in the developed world.
yeah, like 2 blocks from our house.
What I mean by developed world is it's kind of like metaphorically, you know? It's like this is part of the developed world.
Aila's definition of a developed world is a world with no wars. The US is a developed country, yes. It has wars. It's always going to have wars. The world is always going to have wars, so it's never going to be a developed world.
Chloe! We know we agree. What I mean, okay, fine. The developed areas, the developed convos, the developed
The
Uh,
developed sounds
I
sure.
the
believe
developed
Mr. Weeklo has a
situations. I'm not
comment.
saying that the world is literally developed and it will never in history be a useful emotion.
Aila, why are you getting angry?
I'm
Chloe,
not
why?
getting angry.
I'm not angry. I'm trying to make.
Not
And now I'm
Stop
getting
getting
angry at
angry.
you. I'm getting angry at you.
I seem like I'm getting angry and I am raising my voice because I'm trying to be assertive so that I can get people's attention.
Same.
So I actually want to go back to a point that you made, which is about, I forget the word that you actually used, Isla, but you said something along the lines of you can retrain or you can be more deliberate about the emotion. Not just the reaction, absolutely the reaction, right? You can be super deliberate about the reaction, but this concept of can you learn to actually control the emotional response that you experience on the inside? And that's true. And so, a lot of, we use a paradigm here in our house that emotions come from thoughts. And they don't necessarily need to be, conscious thoughts. Sometimes the thoughts are subconscious and you feel a very visceral emotion. But if you can surface what those thoughts are and practice having thoughts and cultivating thoughts and beliefs that generate the emotions you would prefer to have, that's actually a practice, that is a, some people call it a spiritual practice, some people call it a, meditative practice, but it is something that gets to like ninja level stuff, but you can learn to control the actual vibration you feel in your body, the emotion itself.
Yeah, exactly.
That's a very, very valid point.
So I have a question for you, and this one is not intended to try to make you angry. When you're saying anger serves no purpose, are you saying feeling any anger at all serves no purpose, or are you saying the expression of that anger externally serves no purpose?
Yes, angry behavior versus the emotion
That
anger.
was not a question you're good use, sweetie.
We can actually use my bonus tip structure. So right now you asked the first question, what do you think, or what is your point of view along those lines, right? Is it the expression of anger or is it the emotion? Well, so the emotion of anger is triggered with the purpose of expression. You need to have control over your emotions in order to not express it and act on it. And having that sit inside you is not very useful because it's not serving any purpose. And even if it were in the developed situations, that could be very highly destructive if not useful. So, yeah. That's what I'm saying.
Can I say something?
Yep.
Yeah. So one thing that's really neat about this is that our families in particular have so much overlap in the nature of our discussions and like family philosophy. And so when we find a difference in the way that we're communicating, that's really interesting. We should pay really close attention to those differences, right? Because it just saves a lot of time, right? To even dive in deep on something like this with somebody where you're not that closely aligned, like you just have to, there's just so much extra work you have to do before you can get to this level of depth and specificity, right? So that's one thing I think is really, really neat about this. So in our household, what Ila's describing is that idea that one can intentionally, through time, exercise free will to make decisions that override the knee-jerk emotional response and the motion associated with that. Like with anger, it's oftentimes to simply lash out and hurt or attack the thing that we feel threatened by, right? And how if one intentionally uses free will to apply actions and thought backing up those actions that is based on another emotion, right? Then one can actually change and alter the emotional response that they would have in the future given the same circumstance. And I'll give you an example. 5 months ago-ish, I was attacked by a 17, 18-year-old-ish kid from a high school that was 2 blocks from my house, and this was in broad daylight. He stole a laptop from a girl right in front of me, like 30 feet in front of me. And so I yelled out, I said, give that laptop back. And he ignored me, and then I yelled louder, give that laptop back. And he ignored me again. I said, give that laptop back or I am going to call the police. At which point he proceeded to turn around and chase after me. And then he started, well, hitting me like all over. And I'm trying to block, you know, he's about as big as I am. And the interesting thing about that experience is that it was the only time that I haven't ever been attacked before. Okay? I've generally tried to avoid those situations. But I wasn't angry at all. I was fearful for my health because he was big enough to hurt me. I was fearful, so I was blocking instinctively. I definitely wasn't. I remember actually in my mind while running thinking that kid is probably very disturbed. You know, and I was thinking about all these statistics of all these kids and mental health problems that I'm writing about all the time. I was like, oh no, you know. And then he's going at me, right? And then he takes off and runs away. And if I were angry, then one, I probably would have hit him back because it was so sudden, and that would have been bad for a number of reasons. One, he's probably a minor, right? That's one. He also happened to be black. And middle-aged white guy hitting black teenager, that just looks really, really bad in the news, especially today, right? And so I'm really glad I didn't. The other one, I don't think it would have solved anything, but I definitely called the police immediately, right? I called the police immediately because this is not good. We can't have people that have, well, I mean, even if he's not mentally ill, you certainly can't have violent people wandering around the neighborhood. So I called the police right away. But I think part of this is like, I've been talking to my kids about how anger as an emotional response, isn't particularly useful now for a very long time. And so they've just consciously spent a lot of time when they feel anger thinking, what action do I want to take, and what emotional response is actually more reasonable in terms of giving me the emotion that I want to get in the future? Because wouldn't it be nice if we felt emotions in response to situations that were aligned with the decisions we want to make? Right? It just makes it easier. So
and you don't have to override it.
Yeah, it's hard to exercise willpower.
Yeah.
You only got so much. So that's the background here. Is us parents are trying to like understand how we're communicating differently. But it's not to say anger bad, because it's like, you have to acknowledge the emotions that you feel. You can't suppress them, right? So you definitely have to acknowledge the reality of your emotions. But I think a goal is to try to have emotional responses that align with what we want to do, so we're not constantly trying to exercise willpower.
One thing that, Nicole, you mentioned about how our thoughts drive our emotions, which I do think, of course, there's a connection there, but I would argue that values drive both our thoughts and emotions. Values basically define, you can know your values by looking at your actions, because you're going to choose to do things that you value, right? So everyone can say what they want about what they value, but we can really know by looking at their actions. And while values drive actions, actions also have an influence on values. So if you change your actions, if you want to like start eating healthier and you start, focusing on, eating healthy things, then that's going to influence what you value. And so because of that, I think what we're talking about is by intentionally changing your actions in response to, feeling anger, and then trying to, using Isla's bonus tip, cultivating compassion, that action can then influence your values, which would then, kind of restart that cycle of values driving emotions, which drive motion or actions. So I think that's kind of overall what we're talking about, but go ahead, Aila.
Yeah, so just responding to my mommy's comment, I don't think that anger is useful, but I also don't think that it's our internal compass. I think that what we value and what we logically deduce is our internal compass. And a lot of the time people have emotional responses that are not useful, and that are usually not, and that are sometimes not like in line with the decisions we'd actually want to make, like and so I think that what we value and what we think is important and the barriers that we draw on is not the emotion anger. And I think that is what our internal compass is.
Okay, internal compass. Okay, so internal, you could say that your internal, there's like two different compasses though. One is the one that's implied by your emotional response. That's the one that you're conditioned to at this moment in time. But then there's another one that's like your intentional, kind of reflective, take a sleep on it compass, right? Which is much more like prefrontal cortex, reflective thinking brain. And they're not the same thing. Like that's like a goal, is that they would be the same, but they're not. And you want to know what both of them are, right? You want to know what you're reflexively feeling, because that is your reflexive, like somebody else wrote an article about the three parts of the brain, right?
Yeah.
Well, each one kind of has its own moral compass, right? And so you want to know if there's a misalignment of those, right? And so that's where like Nicole's, bonus tip of like sleep on it is like sleep on it and then see, okay, are both these compasses, or all three, I guess there's one in the middle, are they pointing in the same direction? And so I think that's why it's like anger, if you're feeling it, well, yeah, it's important. You definitely want to know if your reptilian brain has a moral compass of saying, I should strike back.
One thing that anger does, I was listening to a podcast and he was talking about how anger actually basically conditions the brain to act and to react faster. That's part of what it does. And that's kind of not really what you want if you're living in a developed world where it's not like somebody punches you in an alley and you need to like punch back. But I think that when it comes to, in the book 7 Habits, it talks about like the difference between stimulus and response.
We're talking about 7 Habits!
And then that humans have the ability to choose, how do I want to react? It's not just a squirrel sees a nut and they run after the nut. Like humans have the ability to then contemplate, well, what is the best course of action? And anger basically shortens the distance.
Tastier nut over there.
Yeah. I think that anger kind of shortens that distance, which isn't necessarily what we want if we're trying to intentionally choose our choices and our decisions.
That might be an interesting mental model that could help a little bit. I did a lot of work overseas for a long time, and my background largely involves cross-cultural analysis and relations.
That's awesome that way.
One of the things that I try to apply those tool sets to things beyond just international experiences. I do it at home, I do it in community, I do it at the state and national level as well. Something that I developed is a bit of a mental model to help me figure out what an appropriate response is based off of the influence I need to have in a certain situation. There's basically at the international level, there's 2 worlds. There's the civilized world, where people have rules that are largely based around nonviolent conflict resolution. That's what democracy is at its core. And then the other world is the primitive world, where violence is often the first resort to solve problems and the best one in that context. And so it wasn't until I could identify what situation I was in that I started developing more appropriate responses. And so if you're in a situation where violence is not the answer, which is almost all civilized contexts, then you want to really understand where your emotions are coming from. You want to really understand where that anger is coming from, because if you can find the right questions, that will inform you about yourself in ways that can help you unwind problems that other people may not have. So, there's one of the things I ask myself when I get angry at something somebody else is doing is this person doing something wrong, which is, almost anybody would agree would be wrong. Is this person doing something wrong, or is this person doing something I don't like? That's one of the first questions. And then when I find wrong, I don't like, then I can ask myself a dozen more questions with my mouth shut about, okay, so why does that bother me? What's the origin of that? And it's interesting how often that leads you to a lot of self-development, sometimes in some very uncomfortable ways. So, so as far as, almost everything that we exist in, it needs to be civilized behavior first, that prefrontal cortex Jill mentioned. It's a much higher order of thinking. But at the same time, if you take that into the wrong situation, it can get you killed. So you have to recognize those differences.
Chloe has 2 hands up. 3.
Chloe's not an octopus.
Wait, really quick. I know, but this is so good. You're gonna love it. In Star Wars, the difference between the Sith Lord and the Jedi, is the Sith Lord is like, use your anger, let it flow through you, right? I mean, it's all about like give in, and it gives a certain power, right? But then the Jedi is actually like, they will use lethal force. But part of the training of the Jedi is to do that without being angry. Right? So one
That
can
requires
apply
Jedi
lethal
level
force,
Because then you
but
can make
not
decisions.
as an emotional anger response, but as an intentional response.
But while that is true, the utility of anger is evidenced every time you see a Chihuahua back down a Great Dane.
I can back down a Chihuahua without being angry. Touche. I think I won that argument.
You don't need anger to
Hey,
be
Chloe,
able to
Chloe,
use
go ahead.
power.
Okay. All right. So what Dad was saying earlier, about how he recognizes when he's angry and he like, is it because I sense injustice or is it because I just don't like what they're doing? It's like a tripwire. That's the example he gave me. And I've been waiting for 5 minutes to say that.
Yeah, and for me, anger is, I think, a trigger or tripwire for like some sort of boundary or something. Something's been crossed, right? That's how I use it. But you're right. Even then, I have to think, well, is that an absolute boundary? Do I want to keep that boundary? What is that boundary exactly? Like what,
Does it still serve me?
Does it serve me? Is it useful? Right? I still have to ask all those questions. And yeah, so that's the opportunity for either self-development or reinforcing, right? Self-determination and reinforcing those boundaries and doing something with that. So
By the way, Aila, so this is, I keep forgetting that this is feedback sandwich. All right, this is fascinating conversation, but one thing I want to explicitly praise with what I saw in your presentation is procedure, process. It's something.
Dad's favorite things.
Well, when you develop a process that you can trust, it can solve a lot of problems when you may not be in the best emotional shape to solve them. So when you have guidelines like that, like what you came up with your rainbow bonus tip, you know, that is very effective. You can come up with more on anger, you can come up with processes on anything. But the fact that you're process oriented right now and solving a problem is absolutely exemplary.
Well, and Nicole has a different process, but gets to the place where she wants to be with regards to handling anger. It's a signal to then sleep on it, reflect.
So probably move on to.
So so that's fair. There's more than one way to skin a cat. I hate that phrase. Have more phrases. Ridiculous phrase.
Darn cats.
One way to carve a pumpkin.
So I can see there being some pros and cons with those two, but I think it's interesting how there's what do you do with this emotion? Do you try to train it out and switch it to something else impulsively, or do you use it as a signal? I think it's very interesting. But yeah, we should probably keep going.